growing up in Marshallton, I spent a lot of times outdoors, all around the town. We got to know everyone in town. I was a paper boy for a number of years, knew everyone in town, knew how they lived, knew what was going on, and I just liked being around here. We always had something to do and always had fun doing it. And a lot of my early part of my life in Marshallton was working for Campbell Weir at the Humphrey Marshall House. And he had a cabin over what was then King Ranch on McCorkle's Rock Road that he would go over to paint. And actually, he had some girlfriends, and his mother lived here at his house at one point, and he went over there to not have his mother around. And painting was a good excuse. But we would I'd go over to mow the grass and do things over there, and got used to the King Ranch, McCorkle's Rock Road, which is now the Laurels, part of the Brandywine Conservancy, and just loved it and have loved this area. And early on, I got a sense whenever we went someplace, I always felt better when I came back here. Even today, when my wife and I travel, we go to a lot of great and interesting places, and you love them. But when you come back here, you feel, there's just such a feeling about the place. There was a lot of people that I think moved into this area because they liked the open space and liked the land. And being around them, some of the folks that helped start the fire company and, the farms around here, when we were kids, most of the wives did not work. And there was only one car per family. So every morning, every car would leave the town. There wouldn't be any cars around.
And all the women would be home.
And the women would be home. And so, it's funny because you look back and say, I can remember there was never any cars in town because everybody left every morning and went to work, and they came back at night. So it's some of those things are remarkable. But the town has changed a little, but not a lot. One of the issues that somebody asked was, what was here then is not here now. And the fire company started in this back alley right behind us here, behind the blacksmith shop, and up the alley right in the corner, the little building looks like a 2-car garage. And they used to keep 2 fire trucks in there. And I can remember the guys all standing outside, and then one guy would climb in on the side of the truck and open the door and get in and pull one truck out, and then they get the other truck out, and they get on the trucks and get down the alley. Sometimes they had to push them out and get them started. So that's in the 50s right after the fire company was started. So, but there was some couple houses that aren't here now. Next to the firehouse where their parking lot is, the Woods lived there. And then down next to the church, where you go into the church parking lot, there was 2 small houses that were right on the edge of the road. And I can't remember whether they were attached, but I think they were. One was Maggie Mercer lived in it, and the other side was Ernie Fling's mother, Mrs. Fling. And once they left, the church bought them, and they were torn down. Our house was a white house on top of the hill there, about 4 houses up from the corner, 5 houses up from the corner. And we moved there. Well, we lived in Westchester during the war. I was born just at the end of the war. And my mother had an apartment there. Dad was in the Pacific. And so we moved here in early 1950. Well, my parents were originally from Westchester area. My mother was from the other side of Westchester, in Milltown, along Route 3. And Dad went in the war, and my mother got an apartment on West Chestnut Street, which then was all the Italian section. And my mother, up until most of them are gone, were still friends with all those folks we used to live around. And so my father bought a house here in Marshallton, and one of the reasons he bought it was that it had wide windowsills. So he thought it was stone. It had stuccoed on the outside and plastered on the inside. So he bought the house, and we moved out here in 1950. And we had land that went from Strasburg Road down to Clayton Road, and then we had neighbors and became very friendly with the neighbors. When we moved in, all the houses down there had fences around the yards, and over the years after that, everybody removed their fences because people used to have chickens, and everybody had chickens and maybe a few pieces of like maybe a goat or something, and so they got away from that, and they didn't need the fences anymore. So everybody removed their fences, but we had great neighbors in that area. My father came from a large family. He was the oldest son, and they weren't always a good family. I asked him one time where they lived during the war, or before, when he was growing up, actually, and he said that they lived everywhere in Westchester because they never paid the rent. And before he went, when he was in high school, he actually worked for a milkman with a horse carriage, and the horse knew all the stops and all those kinds of things. And you know, when they talk about collecting coal on the railroad tracks, they did all that. They weren't a very.
What did your dad do?
My father, after he graduated from high school, went to work for the Denny Rayburn Company as a clerk, and he was a clerk at Denny Rayburn Company when he went into the Army, and then after he came back from the war, he went back to work for Denny Rayburn, and when he passed away, he was their marketing manager for Denny Rayburn Company, which it was Denny Tag, then it became Denny Rayburn Company, so in Westchester. I can remember living on West Chestnut Street because we lived right near Berardi's Bakery, and Petey Berardi was about our age, and we were little kids, and if you're familiar with Westchester, Chestnut Street goes east to west, and it slopes downhill towards the west, and it goes right next to New Street, and New Street slopes to the north. Well, if you go down New Street, the Berardi Bakery was underneath that corner building, and you could go down the side. There was a little man door that went in through there, and the bakery was down there, and then they had like a garage door in the back, and all the Italian ladies worked there, and we'd be with Petey, which is one of the sons, and we'd go running down that New Street and run in that door and run through there and grab a bun, and all the Italian ladies would act like they were chasing us up the alley and stuff because they could have easily caught us, but they always acted like they were chasing us, and we always had those little buns we'd grab out of the bakery as we ran through. I would say that when I became aware of changes in this area was during the 60s, when development started to occur. The Marshallton Farms, where Jolene Drive is at the end of the town, they started building that while I had a paper route. And I got a couple customers there, but I thought, you know, these houses don't look right to me. They were new
How
at
old
the,
were you then?
I was probably 14 or something. The houses were, I think they were like $10,000 a piece or something like that. And at the same time, out at the western edge of Marshallton, where there's a new development called Marshallton Walk now, there's 3 or 4 small houses just west of there. That was a PennDOT stone yard, and they piled stone there for working on the highways and stuff, because they didn't used to use a paver, they used to use stone, and they'd mix oil with it, mix it up and roll it, rather than have pre-mixed asphalt to pave on 62. But Crestmont Farms was being developed in the mid-50s, and they put up a billboard out there for selling lots for Crestmont Farms, and they were $10 down and $10 a month. You could buy a housing lot out at Marshallton Farms, and I can remember that area. The restrictions of development around this area started to occur in the 60s, and actually Ed Hill, who we'll be talking to later, was a supervisor, and he was one of the ones that said we should have zoning to protect land use and that kind of thing. And I can remember the folks that were opposed to it. Earl Barwell, and he was our elected tax collector, and the Barwells said we don't want people telling us what to do with our property. And Ed was the other way. Well, Ed was a supervisor for 6 years, and probably he wanted to institute the zoning, and they voted him out of office. And so the next Board of Supervisors went in and put in zoning right away. And Ed grew up here in the town also.
Oh, so
Yeah, his family lived in the house that we live in presently, and his father was was worked on the farm and was kicked by a horse and died. So the family moved up here into Marshallton, right up the street, but 2 houses up from here. And then Ed was born up here in Marshallton, and has stayed in Marshallton and lived here all his life. Everyone realized that Marshallton had been preserved just because of happenstance over the years. And this was a drover's road. Marshallton was really important in the 1700s because of the road that went from here to Strasburg and Lancaster, and then the other way to Philadelphia. And this was halfway in between. It was a day's ride from either one. And so Marshallton got built at that time, had a number of local industries that had to do with the drover's road. And then they started using Route 30, and that became easier because it didn't have as many hills. It was flatter, easier to travel, and everybody went around Marshallton.
It was a
So,
ship in a bottle.
yep,
in
and
time.
it was a ship in the bottle, and it lasted all those years. And once you came here, you just appreciated its uniqueness and the houses and everything was, and the people were kind of like, when I grew up here, the people all seemed old too. I mean, they were old people, and it was funny because I moved here when I was 5, and the people that lived here never considered me a person from Marshallton, and until I outlived them all, and now they're all gone, and now I'm a person from Marshallton. I've been here 70 years. When I grew up here, and I always tell everyone, I grew up inside a Norman Rockwell painting, and that's what Marshallton has been. As kids, we could do things that other kids never had the opportunity to do. Just being around the farms, riding horses. We used to all carry 2 or 3 of us, I should say all of us. We always carried a .22 rifle, and every farm had a dump, and you could go shoot rats or shoot tin cans or bottles, that kind of thing. You could shoot bow and arrows all over the place, and you could roam all over the place. And one of the things that we did, we got our milk locally from farms. There was 3 farmers here that sold milk to the local citizens, and it was raw milk. I mean, we always drank raw milk, and it was Charlie Tangy and the Yerkes and the Busbys. So everybody got their milk from one of those places, and you had milk cans. We'd take the cans to the farm, and what you'd do, you'd leave a clean can, and you'd pick up one. It'd usually be in a water trough with water running through it to keep it cool, and you pick it up and take that home, and then every couple of days you'd take that back, and you'd take the cream off the top. You could make butter from it, and if you left it out in the porch, it would lift the lid up when it froze in the winter. But one of the fun things as a kid, like my cousin would come out and stay. He lived in Westchester, so he'd come out to the country. He'd stay with me. We'd go up to the Charlie Tangy's farm to get the milk, and the fenced-in area next to the barn where the cows would go in to get milked was always real sloppy with manure and mud and everything else. But we'd sit, there was a board fence on either side of it. We'd sit on the top of that board fence and throw rocks or whatever we could in there, and the other guy would sit on the other side. We'd try to splash each other with the manure and stuff. I mean, that was fun for country boys. We didn't see that many deer when pheasants. Oh, the pheasants were, and rabbits and stuff were all over the place, and there was a lot of people would hunt that, but they would go up in the mountains to hunt deer. I don't remember too many people hunting deer around here. They'd go up in the mountains to do that. We ate very good, and everybody in Marshallton had a garden. So there was a lot of canning going on. My mother put up all kinds of vegetables, tomatoes. We'd wrap onions and potatoes in newspaper and put them down the cellar at the end of the.
And how long would that last?
Through the winter.
The whole winter?
Yeah, it was, if you had enough of them, yeah. So we had a lot. And the other thing about Marshallton was the Cans, who were the principal family in Marshallton. Harry Can was like the guy you went to if you wanted to borrow money or something, and a lot of people worked. At the end of the war, and into the early part of the 50s, a lot of the people worked at Esco Cabinet Company, and they made freezers. everybody in Marshallton had an Esco freezer. So everybody froze things. The other things we do with the farmers around here, everybody would buy beef from a farmer. So your neighbor would say, I'm going to get a cow from a steer from somebody. Do you want to go halves or quarters? And you'd buy a half a cow or half a quarter of a cow, and you put that in the freezer for the winter and so forth. And then you had all the canned goods. And as kids, we had to always help plant the garden and work in the garden. Our meals were a typical meat, potatoes, and vegetable type thing. If we didn't have, if we had a dessert, it was a pie or something somebody made. We didn't have ice cream. We didn't buy ice cream and keep it at home. If we wanted ice cream for an occasion, where the Four Dogs is today was Chambers grocery store. And then it was McHugh's had it, and Mr. Reed, I forget his first name, Reed had it. But you'd go up and they had a big paddle, and they had what looked like French fry boats today. And you'd say, I want a pint of ice cream, and they'd get one of these boats out, and you'd choose it, and they'd paddle it out, put it on a scale to weigh it, see how much you got, and then you pay for it, and you take that home, and you'd probably eat it right. I don't remember going in and getting the ice cream, except later, my neighbor who owned a gas station in Westchester, he had a huge Esco freezer, and he loved ice cream, and he would get those big, 5 gallons or something, the big buckets. And he would always have that in there. And as kids, they were our favorite people because they always had ice cream. And we'd go over there and have ice cream quite often. I mean, the gentleman that I said kept the ice cream, they were like grandparents to us. And even to our kids when they were born and until the older folks passed away. I mean, they were, and we just knew everybody in Marshallton. And as kids, everybody looked out for you, but they also looked out for your parents. And I always thought, it's funny because we didn't have cameras like we have today and recorders and so forth, but I couldn't figure it. I always felt all the trees must have had something in them, because whenever I did something, by the time I got home, my parents knew it. And it was typical of all the kids. You couldn't get away with doing something you weren't supposed to doing, because it'd be, I don't know how they did it, but they did it. People lived in Marshallton either because they made a choice and could have, wanted to live here and could afford to, or they lived in Marshallton because they couldn't afford to live in the towns. And so, most of the homes in here were folks that were living hand to mouth. And, so today's world, you can't, as a person growing up in Marshallton and Marshallton area, it's very difficult to be able to afford to start out and live here. Now, when I started out and I was growing up, I had people that would help me stay here. I mean, we knew the people that had the banks and all those kinds of things, and they would bend over backwards to help you out anytime. And the folks in merchants in Westchester, I always tell a story about my wife and I when we were first married. And we'd go into Westchester on Friday night because the banks were only open during the week when you were working, and Friday nights. So everyone would go to Westchester to shop and go to bank on Friday nights. And we were in one of the stores, excuse me, we were in one of the stores, and we were in a discussion, just standing there, and said, oh, well, I wanted to do that this week. And I said, I didn't keep enough money out of the bank to do that. And the person that owned the store said, Jack, how much do you need? I said, about $50, which was a lot of money then. He got in his cash register, handed me $50. My wife was not from this area. She was astonished. She said, he just gave you $50. I said, yeah, I'll bring it back next week. And that's what you did. So everybody around here worked together. Why would you want to leave? I think a lot of our old buildings are at risk because people can't afford to own them. And it's at one time, Bill Baldwin, that owned Baldwin's Book Barn, was buying up every property in Marshallton he could. He was going to the idea was make a Williamsburg type village out of it. And that didn't come to fruition, but, it raised the prices on the houses, and as a result of that, people bought them that could afford to take better care of them, because they said it was a hand-to-mouth living. There were folks that didn't have the wherewithal to do things in a proper manner, and they would do what they could. And I think even though when he was doing that, we all hated it because we didn't want some outsider coming in and buying up all the houses in Marshallton and raising the prices, but it probably helped preserve the village more. So it's always interesting to say what affects how things will be preserved and how they can be preserved, that kind of thing. But I think that making sure that the older properties can be maintained. I mean, an example is the meeting house. There, I mean, they're good people there. And I like the Quakers. I like the Quaker religion in a lot of ways, but there's not enough of them to maintain that property. And they've had some issues where they just can't get it together to do that. And I'm just wondering what will happen to those properties. I mean, we were over in France last summer, and in one of the cathedrals in the town, I started asking about how they maintained it. It was part of their taxes.
Yeah.
That was a significant part of their community. The church used the building for religious services and to help make sure there was a presence there, but the actual care of the building was a municipal concern. I don't think that'll happen in our in our communities. It's not the way we do things here, but it's an interesting concept that if the Quaker meeting dwindles down to a very few people who can't take care of it, what will happen to the meeting house? That's been an important part of our community for a lot of years. Interesting about the Quaker meeting house, we played there all the time as kids. On the property. And there's the cemetery is enclosed with a stone wall. And at that time, the stone wall was falling down in places, and they kept an old horse in there. It was old. Well, I don't know whether the Quakers kept the horse, but they allowed the horse. There was horses in there, and they used the horse for the Bradford Cemetery, because on either side of the meeting house, from the meeting house out to Northbrook Road, and from the meeting house to what we always called Cans Lane, that when along came out this eastern side of it, there were carriage sheds, and those carriage sheds were full of old farm implements and old vehicles. There was a stagecoach. There was all kinds of things like that weren't used anymore, and they were just put in there and left there. So as kids, we played on all that stuff, and we were always up the Quaker meeting. And old Rob, there was a cart that they kept in one of those stalls and when they dug a grave, Harry Prd and Charlie Bryson, yes, we called him Yes Indeedy. He was a black gentleman, lived out the Albertson farm. The house is still there on the right. It's just a frame shack. And yes, indeed, they'd dig the graves, and they'd put the dirt in this cart that was hooked to old Rob. And then they'd take old Rob up Northbrook Road, and there used to be an entrance to the meeting house at the top of the hill. And that they'd come in there and they'd just have Rob stand there with the cart while they had the funeral. Then they'd go back down and dump the dirt back into the grave after the services. When he would go up Northbrook Road, he was getting old, as we remember, and he would slip on the road. So as kids, we'd all get behind the cart. We'd push on the cart, help old Rob push the cart back up to the meeting house. So it was kind of fun. Then they started digging the graves with a backhoe, and I don't know whatever happened to old Rob, but then at one point the Quakers got in and they rebuilt all the stone wall that had been around the cemetery. In Marshallton, I think that right now there's a lot of interest in preserving what's here and keeping the feeling and the way the village is. There's always the feeling, and I was involved in local government and still am, but there's always that balance of getting people to do what you think is the right thing and allowing them to do what they want to do and making it what it should be. There's all those tensions that go on, and I think as long as you recognize those tensions, you can do the right thing to try to make it happen. But again, it's going to be circumstances, the economy, and everything. But there'll always be people that, like, some people like music, some people like racing cars. It's that same type of thing. I don't care whether the millennials don't buy things today, but there's still going to be an appreciation of what we have here, and it's lasted several hundred years. I told you about my father's house and thinking it was a stone property, and we had the hurricane come through in 1954. It was a Friday night. I don't remember the exact date, early October, and one of my friends was at the house, and he lived in the center house, which is now the Martin's Tavern ruins. And it started to get bad right after dinner. I guess he was up having dinner with us, and he was going to go home because it was really starting to blow. My father said, "No, you're going to stay right here with us till this is over." And about that time, our house was stucco. The western corner of the house, all the stucco blew off, which was interesting because found out that it was not a stone house. It was a log cabin, 2-story log cabin. And we had always been told that the house was about 300 years old, and I think some recent interests from some other folks have found that it is probably that old. But we never had a stone house, and I don't know whether my father was disappointed, but we lived there until he passed away, and we lived there until we married, moved away by that time. But it was interesting that my father said, "I know we have a stone house because we have these wide windowsills." It was very typical of a stone property, and the stucco on the outside was not smooth; it was lumpy and stuff. And but we found out in Hurricane Hazel, and I think the winds were maybe 75 or 80 miles an hour. I can remember those numbers everybody talked about. I don't remember many other problems. I may have been too young to realize the other problems, but there were some places blown down. There was more damage in the snowstorm of '58 than there was in Hurricane Hazel in '54. And one of the things that I was always taught, and I don't know what it was in my life, that a village was a village, and it was always surrounded by farms. And most of what we've been able to do in various instances, and I worked for the township for a number of years, was to ring the village with preserved land. And we've pretty much accomplished that. We have more to do, but there's always more to do. But through various means through our planning commission and through our zoning and through other interests of other people, we were able to preserve the outside ring to have farms next to the center of the village. One of the questions that I saw about the village was what it was like when we first came here in the first 10 years, from say 1950 to 1960. And the village was, as I said, there was mostly ladies didn't have driver's license. It was single family, and I can remember my mother learning to drive, and we kids thought she would kill us in her driving habits, which probably weren't bad at all. And then, other people, I remember Honey Johnson got a driver's license, and she lived up here. Her husband was a police chief, so they got a second car, so he'd have the first car for his police duties. The police chief was the only police officer.
The original two-car family.
Yep, yeah. So, because he used one for other work. And so it was funny, but at that time we had a bus that came through Marshallton. Brandywine Transit. It originated out in Mortonville, or Modena, and it would come through town. It ran on the hour, go in on the hour, and the half hour would come back out. And then eventually it would go into Westchester in the morning. At lunchtime, it would come back out, and right after lunch, go back in. And at 5 o'clock, it would come back out, bring people home. We called it the Puddle Jumper. There were no bus stops, and all of the ladies, if they wanted to take the bus into town, they would just walk out and stand in front of their house. They'd just stand there, and the bus would stop and pick them up. And when my wife and I were married and she first moved out here, she would say, "What are those ladies doing standing on the road?" For years, and that literally years, after the bus stopped running, the ladies, if they wanted to go into town, would go out and stand in front of their house. And the local person would pick them up and take them into Westchester. And when you came out 162, the ladies would stand there by Ernie Fink's gas station. I think it's a Subway or something now. They would stand there, and if you were going to Marshallton, you'd see the ladies stand there. You'd stop and pick them up and bring them home. And that went on for years. We belonged to the church in Westchester, the Holy Trinity Church. And when I was a young boy, I was a choir boy, sang soprano, so you can imagine the age. And we had choir practice on Wednesday afternoon and Thursday nights. And I'd go in Wednesday afternoon after school, and I'd thumb a ride to Westchester. I was probably 8, 9 years old. You'd thumb a ride to go to choir practice. My father, when he's done work, he'd pick me up at the church, and we'd come home. Of course, Thursday nights, he was in the men's choir, so he'd take me in. We'd have an hour with the boys, and then the men's choir, and then come home. But things were much simpler that way, and thumbing a ride or stand along the road to get a ride was what everybody did. It's just how you got around. We had 3 stores back then. The Four Dogs Tavern was Chambers Grocery Store. And across the street was Arkle Junta's store. And Arkle was also a butcher, and he had like a big cold locker there, and he would butcher. At the corner down here of Northbrook and Strasburg Road was a gas station, and on the left side of it they had a big door, and they'd change oil and that kind of stuff. They had one of those pits in the floor, and they'd change oil and that kind of stuff, and sold gas. And then eventually they started getting groceries in, and they would sell some groceries also. And there was a gas station that the Geisels had built down where that development is down there. So there was a lot of commerce in town. I guess, of course, people, when they went to the grocery store, they didn't bring a whole lot of stuff, because these ladies that went to town, they'd have a bag of groceries with them when they coming back. Playing with other kids, we all had our bicycles, and we'd bike around here. In fact, we would go down to Glen Hall Bridge, which was a double-length covered bridge, and down along the west branch of the Brandywine. And if it was a day like today where you're having on and off showers or something, we'd get down there on our bikes and race back and forth through that bridge all day long with 3 or 4 guys, and then bike home in the rain and stuff. That's where we'd go. We'd play in the streams around here. I mean, we always, and all the pastures and fields had either steers or cows or something. And we always said if we were thirsty, we would drink out of a stream as long as the water went over 3 rocks. It would be purified. And so we did. And we always, I always said that's why I was always healthier than my sister, because I always drank out of the local streams. At the corner of 162 and Strasburg Road was a gentleman by the name of Charlie Staub, that had a small engine repair, lawnmowers and things like that. And we'd get down there to fix our bicycles, and he would let us he had boxes of old nuts and bolts, and we could find parts we needed, and he'd let us use his equipment to do that. And the other part was going down to Cope's Bridge. Albert Lambert had a bicycle shop, and we'd get down there to get parts and stuff also. So we'd ride down to Cope's Bridge and do that. In Marshallton, we played baseball. I don't remember ever playing football here. Played with other places, but most of the kids in Marshallton played baseball. There were Ted Baldwin, the Baldwin farm. He was a professional baseball player. One of the Ludwig boys was playing for a professional team. So there was a lot of baseball players, and that was a big deal around here. There was a lot of local teams that would go from town to town to play baseball in the evenings and stuff. That was the main pastime. And as kids, we'd come up here to the blacksmith stop. Behind here was Mcallister's barn, and at the corner there was 2 fences that came together, board fences, and they would form like a baseball diamond out in the field, and there was cows in the field too, so there was other obstacles. But we would come up after dinner and play baseball, boys and girls, because there weren't enough boys to form two teams or enough girls. There were boys and girls, so we'd all play baseball. And Harry Can, that lived in the house behind you, just west of the blacksmith shop, was an avid baseball fan. He was the one that owned Esco Cabinet Company and probably the wealthiest person in town. He participated with the Philadelphia Athletics. They were the other next to the Phillies in Philadelphia. And he went to spring training with them. When I was a newspaper boy, when I went in to collect every week, we'd go into his study, which was full of baseball memorabilia from all kinds of famous baseball players and so forth. But he would have these famous baseball players from the Athletics come out and have dinner with him. And they would see us playing baseball out here in the field, and they'd come out and play baseball. We probably played baseball with some famous baseball players, but we didn't care. We were country kids. We wanted to play baseball. We didn't care who they were. They weren't important to us. Not like you do today. You wouldn't know them because we didn't have television back then. And we went to school up here at the Marshallton School, which was 4 rooms at that time for 6th grades. And what people don't realize back then, there were no lights on the baseball fields, and the World Series was always played in the daytime. So I can remember the teachers putting a radio and opening the window on top, just a little bit above the radio, so we get better reception, and we always listened to the World Series in elementary school because it was played during the day. You'd pick up sides, or there'd be 4 on one side and 6 on the other, and you'd say, well, you come over and play on this side, and so you'd even it up a bit, and it was just fun stuff. I don't remember if we ever even kept score. I think we just played baseball, but it was. And then we used to go up to the school. The school was originally a smaller lot, and then built the land around it, or bought the land around it. And
What was the name of the school?
it was a Marshallton Elementary School. Back then, the townships had a school board. Each township had their own school board, had their own schools. So that was a West Bradford Elementary School. Once you were out of 6th grade, in the early 50s, while I was in elementary school, once the kids went to high school in West Bradford Township, they could go to Downingtown, Coatesville, Westchester, or Unionville. It was their choice. And then those school boards would send them a bill for the students that went to their school. So if you lived, like we're closer to Westchester, you could go to Westchester. Some of the kids went to Downingtown, or close to Downingtown or Coatesville, depending upon where you lived in the township. And then the state made them form the joint school board for high school. And then we all went to Downingtown High School, what's now the STEM Academy. That was 7th through 12th grade. And it wasn't all of that building. There was a smaller building there then. They were split between 4 rooms, and the 6th grade kids had their own room. So the other 5 grades were split between 3 rooms. So you could move up during the year to a higher part of your class and be in a 2nd grade room or something like that. I for my life, I can't remember how it was divided up, because by the time I got to 6th grade, they did, maybe I was in 5th grade, they put the 2-room addition onto that school, so there'd be 1 room for each grade. And that's when they added more land up there to the school ground, so you could go up, and then we'd go up and play baseball up there, because ground. But we'd go up and we'd walk to school, come home for lunch. Sometimes we'd carry our lunch to school and go up the back alley here. And I can remember when we'd leave school in the afternoon, we would have some of the people would be getting their chickens, because there was chicken coops all along the north side of there, and people had chickens for eating and for hens. And I remember Biddy Ross would always get a big kick out. He had a chopping block. He'd chop the head off a chicken and run around the alley when us kids were coming home from school. And here at the blacksmith shop, in the afternoon, you could hear Mr. Ludwig with his working the anvil, and he'd be shoeing horses. So we always stopped and cranked the bellows for him. The bellows that are here now are not the ones that were here when we were kids. And he was a big guy, but he's very nice, and he always threw his old horseshoes in a keg and it was a wooden keg, not as we think of a keg today. And he had that other anvil there, and he'd let us put the horseshoes in the fire while he was working, doing his work. We could put the horseshoes in the fire and heat them up, take them, beat the heck out of them on that other anvil, and we just had a ball. I mean, we're elementary school kids. Today, they wouldn't let you near a blacksmith shop. But 2 or 3 of us would come in and crank the bellows. But every kid in Marshallton had a horseshoe nail ring that Mr. Ludwig would make. When you were here, he'd make one for everybody. So every kid would stop in at some point and get a ring made for him, have a ring, a horseshoe nail ring. And then the school hours were interesting because the township didn't have any school buses. And so the high school had school buses. So they would rent those buses, but what would happen was they would have to pick up the kids here for it was only one bus, maybe, or 2 at the most, around the township to come to the elementary school before they used them to pick up the kids for the high school. And then in the afternoon, we went to school till sometime after 4 o'clock, 4:15 or 4:30, because they would have to deliver the kids home from the high school before they picked up the elementary school kids to take them home. So we'd wait for the buses to come home. So we had a long school day. Everybody loved Miss Anna, and she was the principal when I first went to school there. And then she left, and Miss Hagley, who lived in Cochranville, became the principal. And Miss Wickersham lived right across the street here. Miss Otter lived in Westchester. Greenwood, I don't know where she lived. I can't remember. Miss McIntyre, she was the first grade teacher. I remember her. That lady was scary. But I don't know where she lived, but I think she lived not too far away. But I have, Ed Stofe gave me the book that the school board used for West Bradford Township when I went to elementary school. And those teachers were paid $50 a month, and the principal got $10 extra a month for being principal. And that was their pay in the 50s. $50 a month is what they earned. And that's why I never learned very much. Apparently they used to do carriages and stuff, and I think I can remember on the roof out back there used to be a carriage that sat up there for some reason. But I've heard that they did work upstairs, but I don't remember anybody ever doing any work in this side or even coming in this side. It was only the side where he was working, and he'd have the horses underneath the shed there. When he was shoeing them, they'd bring them in and they'd do them. And as the 50s go on and people got more used to using automobiles and stuff, then the farriers started going to the farms and stuff, and people stopped bringing their horses into the blacksmith shop. They used to go to the horses. That was Mcallister's barn, and they had some cows not a big herd, just a few cows. I don't know what they did with the milk because we never got milk from them. The Mcallisters lived here, and Billy Mcallister was one of the boys that was killed in the Second World War from Marshallton, and I think it was right after D-Day he got killed, and his car was in a garage along the alley here. And I remember as a kid, his father had it on cinder blocks, but he would still go out and every few days start the car up and run it. And over the years that disappeared. I think the building's kind of collapsed now or gone. But it always was remarkable to me that his father took care of that car. And, they had the Gold Star flag in their window because I was their paper boy. And, it was always meant something to me, and it was important. I was involved with the fire company from an early age. I was not here at that fire, and I don't remember when it burnt down. There was a barn right behind the Marshallton Inn that burnt down sometime in the 60s that burnt down also. The Chambers grocery store burned out back in the early 50s, and that was put out by the Downingtown Fire Department. Back then, you just called whoever you wanted to call. Some people called Westchester. Harry Cann's garage burnt down in the 50s, and that was on a Saturday morning because I remember my father and I getting in the car to go in town to get a haircut and come up the street, and there was a fire engine there, and the whole garage was in flames from but it's a Westchester fire truck. But interestingly enough, it was right after that they decided to start the fire company out here, and Harry Can didn't think we needed our own fire company, and I can remember people being upset that everybody in the community wanted their own fire company, and Harry said we couldn't afford it and he wouldn't back it. However, he was supportive of the fire company, and as the owner of Esco Cabinet Company, he used to send over the years his maintenance people out to take care of the building. When the fire company first did this building up here where they are now, he would send his maintenance people out to help take care of it, and they did the painting and all that kind of stuff for a number of years. So he was supportive of it once it happened, but I can remember people talking that they were upset that he was not in favor of it, and after his garage burnt down. During the summer, and even in the winter, even in the cold weather, as kids we camped out. There was a pond over at Campbell Weir's place, and little woods beside it, and we were always camping there. In fact, we ended up building a log cabin that we stayed in even winter. We'd ice skate. We'd fish in the pond, catch bass. We had a potbelly stove. We'd cook them on the stove. And so we were always outside, out in the country, not specifically in town. We did have street lights. They looked like an upside-down dish pan with a little tiny light in it. And
They were electric, I assume.
electric, yeah. I'm not that old. The street lights had a habit. They looked like colanders after a while, because some of the folks wanted to practice their shooting, and I knew who the folks did it. It was Billy Baldwin and Barry's boys, Alex Barry. They used to go through town on Friday night in a pickup truck, and someone would lay in the back of the pickup truck, and they'd go at different speeds and see how many street lights they could shoot out on the way through town. And that was the big sport back then. and those guys are gone, but I always said it was Alex did the shooting and Billy was doing the driving, but it was the reverse. Billy was actually a very good shot, and I
didn't find out that till later in life.
I didn't find out until later in life. Was when Alex was older and Billy was older. We'd be together for various reasons. I used to take Alex up to the Pennsylvania Farm Show, and we were talking about it, and he explained it to me. And a funny story, I've got to tell you the story. Billy Baldwin was, of course, a farm boy, and by the way, I confirmed the other story about the shooting, who did what, and the way they got caught was they missed one of the lights, and they came back, and somebody told the police, and I don't know who the police were, but Billy told me the whole episode of the police coming to the farm and how things worked out from there, which everything got straightened out. But they were down at the farm behind where I live now on Wawaset Road, and Billy told Alex that they were going to catch a skunk. And so the easiest way for a farm boy to catch a skunk is you got to keep their tails down. And so he'd take the hay rake out, leave it out in the field, and you go out in a pickup truck, you saw the skunk run around the field, you'd head him underneath the rake, and as he went under the rake, you'd jump out with a burlap bag and snatch him up. And so they did that, and then they take him into Westchester, and they went up, and they would see people coming up the street, and they would dump the skunk out and jump back in the truck. And they would tell me stories about laughing so hard that they couldn't get back in the truck, and the guy that was driving the truck would try to take off and stuff like that. These are true stories. I've confirmed it by talking with both people, separately, and they both tell me the stories. But and then they start laughing. I mean, it must have been really funny. But that's the kind of stuff that happened around Marshallton as a kid. But at night, we would go up to the grocery store, the Chambers grocery store, and you talk about, I don't know why I mentioned that did burn out, and didn't burn the building down, just burn out the store part of it. And they cleaned it up and rebuilt it, or reopened it as a grocery store. But when you went into the grocery store, if you went back where they kept, you have to remember then also you could get 2 cents on a bottle for a soda bottle. So there was, in the back there was stacks and stacks of empty soda bottles that people would bring in, then they'd give to the distributor and so forth. But back by the heater, they had a shuffleboard, and all the old chairs in town that people want and didn't want or whatever, and they were up there, and there was a shuffleboard and spittoons, and all the guys the older guys would go there at night, just walk through the store, and they'd go in, they talk and shoot shuffleboard and spit and chew. And that's why it became the Spit and Chew Club.
The Four Dog Tavern is.
That's where the Four Dog Tavern was. And the grocery store would close, and then the guys in the Spit and Chew Club would just go out the back door and make sure the door was locked behind them. That was the way it was.
Women allowed?
Never saw a woman in there, no. I guess they weren't good chewers. But, yeah, those guys would be sitting there. And it was guys from all walks of life. I mean, it was, people that were laborers and people that were, Freddie Hoops was a big realtor in town, and Harry Can. Everybody would gather there. And beyond that, I was never part of it, but there were a lot of card games that went on around this town at that time. I mean, for poker, for money. Zip Durnall was known to do a lot of gambling. He owned Weathermaster Window Company. They made storm windows and doors and so forth. The story was that he worked with the Cans when they started the Esco freezers and stuff, and he was part of the group, and somehow or another he got squeezed out, and the Cans got upset, or he got upset with the Cans, so they helped him start this other business which he had. So the Cans were in charge of the community back like in the 40s and earlier than that. So it was.
What do you remember of holidays, for instance? Did you go out trick-or-treating on Halloween? Did you go out on Mischief Night?
We did.
At Christmas time, were there any special events in town?
I can't remember any special events at holidays in town that were put on by anybody. I mean, there's three organizations. There was the Grange, which was an important farming organization at that time, the church, and the fire company. Fire company started in '53. So after the fire company, it was always something happening there, but it was no big celebrations of community events other than Memorial Day, when we'd have the parade, and the Memorial Day parade was always on Sunday before Memorial Day, because the big towns would get all of the people, the organizations, so they started doing it. It was arranged by Harry Purdue, and Chris Anderson used to be the host and Chris Anderson was from Chadds Ford. He was also a radio host on WCOJ, the local radio station, and so he would be the host for the memorial services. And that was the only one I think was celebrated as a community, other than part of the organizations. I mean, there was other things that went on, like the hunt. The turkey raffles were a big deal back then, and the hunt would have a turkey raffle at the Grange Hall here, and I can remember as a kid going there and my father winning a turkey, and you got the turkey, a live turkey. They were in crates, and people would walk out there with turkeys. And I can remember my father took him down to Bill Yerke's because they had a thing to get feathers off of chickens and stuff, and they cleaned the bird, killed it and cleaned it and got it ready for Thanksgiving for us. And the fire company always had turkey raffles. And I can never remember the fire company having live birds, but they had fresh birds. And then after a while, because people would come to a turkey raffle to get fresh turkeys. Mm-hmm. And then, people started going, and the fire company started getting frozen turkeys, and that whole tradition's gone away. They couldn't make money out of it anymore. So, but that's the only thing that would happen around the holidays. Mm-hmm. But
so, Jack, talking about events, I know the snowstorm of '58 was a pretty big event in Marshallton.
Right.
Could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, the snowstorm of 1958, and apparently it was a major storm, but if you hear the weather people in Philadelphia or any place around here talk about it, they never mention it, because I think it was really like a smaller storm in geographical area, and it really hit this area. So it was started on the first day of spring, and I can remember WCOJ, which is back then all you had was an AM radio, and it was a local radio that you'd listen to. They kept saying we're going to have snow flurries, and it started snowing, and it was a heavy, wet snow, and it just kept coming down. And you talk about Babe the Blue Ox, the Paul Bunyan stories. It was so wet it looked blue. It was heavy, and I can remember going up to Campbell Weir's, because I worked there on his farm. I helped take care of the horses, did mowing and stuff. And went up there to shovel, and I can remember shoveling his driveway for 3 or 4 days because it was heavy and hard. But the roads were closed. The electricity went out for well over a week. The snow was so heavy that the arms on all of the utility poles actually collapsed straight down, broke off and collapsed straight down. And a lot of poles themselves went over. Buildings collapsed. It was really a heavy snow. And the state, it wasn't PennDOT then, it was the State Department of Highways. And you have to remember back in the 50s, trucks were not as heavy and as powerful as they are today. But they came, I remember them coming through town here with the highway trucks, and they would hit that snow, and they would get about 10 feet, and they'd snap an axle. And they'd hook another truck, and they'd pull it back, and then they'd put another truck up there and snap an axle. They got as far as Northbrook Road, and they left. And it was a couple days later, a big Army bulldozer came through town, and that's how they opened the roads. And they just pushed, up the sides and so forth. It was, and I have
Marshall was closed down for about a week.
yeah, and well, the road was open from here to Westchester, but it wasn't open any further. And at that time, there's a person by the name of Bradford Hoxter that was born during that storm, and he lived his parents lived down on Telegraph Road, and the fire company got together and they dug by hand from the top of Sugars Bridge Road down to Telegraph Road, a trail, took a sled down and put his mother on a sled and pulled him all the way up here to Marshallton, and then they hauled him into the hospital, and that's why his name's Bradford, after the fire company. So at the West Bradford Fire Company. And then the fire company they had a portable generator, and they put that on a sled. As I said, everybody in town had an Esco freezer, and they would go from house to house and plug the freezers in for an hour on that generator, and they did that for all week long, just pulling that sled with that generator all around town to get people, keep their food from going bad. So, and it was 53 inches. I can remember taking a 2 yardsticks up at Campbell Weir's house. I took 2 yardsticks, pushed one all the way down to the ground, stood the other one on top of it, and it was 53 inches.
It was a heavy snow.
It was a heavy snow of 53 inches. Trees were broken down, and like Campbell Weir's property was the arboretum there that Humphrey Marshall had started, and there was a lot of what I thought were famous boxwood trees and a lot of boxwoods there. It destroyed all of those boxwoods in that area. In fact, down at Longwood Gardens, it destroyed a lot of their fancy boxwoods and so forth. I was born at the end of the war. Mm-hmm. I always said that Hitler found out that I was born, he gave up. But so when we moved out to Marshallton, it was still very significant that there was 3 boys from this town that were killed. And Mcallister boy, the Harple, I forget the other one. But there was 8 total boys from West Bradford Township. And the interesting that happened, and I never found this out till later, but people that were involved in the community, I never knew who fought during the war or who was part of what, who did anything. And you'd find out later, Bill Hill, who was the fire chief before me, he spent most of his time in Florida as an aircraft mechanic, fixing engines for airplanes. And you never knew that until later. But one time when the Memorial Day services were at the cemetery, at the Bradford Cemetery, every year most of the kids from Marshallton or people who lived in Marshallton would come back because they'd know they'd see their neighbors. And I would meet several people, and that's where I got a lot of the stories about what happened during the war. And one I thought was really, really important was Chess Hall. Chess Hall was involved with the fire company for years as a secretary. He was never a firefighter. He was part of the corporate end, and there were several guys in the town, in the area that were like that. And so I knew him and so forth. And one day, down at the Memorial Day and walking around the cemetery afterwards, and meet up with Chess Hall. He had moved away, hadn't seen him for years. And we started talking, and I found out that he was shot down in an aircraft over Germany during the war and spent 9 months as a POW. And he started telling me stories, and what he told me was that the day, back then, any notices from the military were done by telegram. And the telegrams were delivered to Marshallton by taxi cab. And he said on the day that his parents got notified, excuse me, I'm still picturing, but the day that his parents got notified that he was missing in action, 3 taxi cabs came, one for Billy, and one for another fellow. It's on that same day in town. Now, Chess and I talked, and I knew him all my life, and that was the first time I knew all that. And so we talked for quite a while, and he said, I'm going to come back next year, and I'm going to tell you more. And I was so excited. He passed away that year. Never did get the rest.
That's the way they were, though. They never talked
Yep.
about it.
But pardon me, because, he was a good friend. We had a number of exceptional characters, and I'm not sure whether they were that exceptional. We had a lot of characters. Let me just talk about Charlie Bryson. And Charlie Bryson was a black fella that lived here up at Albertson's farm, and he was like a local handyman. And he had a habit, when he talked to you, he would always say, yes, sirree, yes, sirree, yes, indeedy, yes, indeedy. So we always called him Yes, indeedy. And that was, and it was funny. And even after our kids were born, we were living here in Marshallton, he would stop by the house. And he was a wonderful fellow, but he would always address our children as Miss or Mr., Master or something. He would always have a title before their names. That's the way he was raised, and you wouldn't think of that today. But Charlie was, he worked for the township with help with I think there was 1 or 2 people. It's mostly maintaining dirt roads, and he worked for other folks. In fact, I think he passed away over at Hamilton's off of Route 322. I think he was raking their yard or something when he passed away. But nice fellow.
Do you have a family?
No.
Any kids or anything?
No. There was Martha Washington and Mr. Sherman lived there in the house with him when we first moved to Marshallton. I have no idea what their relationship was, but they both passed away, and then Charlie was there for a lot of years. Mr. Sherman wore a top hat and tails all the time. And Martha Washington, I don't know whether that was her name or not, or just a name that's what we know her by. But other than that, there was a pair of characters that lived there's a house that the meeting house owns up at the corner, and Tilly and Bill lived there. She was a plasterer, and he was her helper. And she had the habit of drinking a lot and so forth, and she would get rather crazy, and they would take her into Westchester and put her in the jail, and the jail was there at the corner of Market and New, and she'd rip up the plumbing and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stories about her. But I can tell you, when I was a paper boy, I'd deliver papers, and I'd be walking up the lane by the meeting house, and he would come running out of the house screaming, and she'd come following, swinging a crowbar in the air, trying to hit him with it and stuff. I don't know what they had an argument about something, but the house was all stacked with newspapers and everything else, and she would always give me something to eat, an apple or something like that. And so I'd put it in my paper bag, and because the place seemed a little bit dirty to me, and so I'd wait till I get down on Northbrook Road and throw it in the gutter because I was afraid to eat it. It might not be safe to eat and stuff. But I broke my arm, and I was delivering papers, And so she gave me a bottle of horse liniment, and I was supposed to put that on my arm, get rid of that cast and put that on my arm. I mean, she meant well, but, you know, they were characters, but they did plastering. She did the work and so forth. There was a druggist where the fire company first housed their trucks. Before that, there was folks by name of Cathcart lived in that house, and he was a druggist, and he made some kind of pharmaceutical compounds in that garage. And I remember as a kid, he had Tommy Cathcart was my age, and Tommy, we'd be playing, and he would take us in there, and he would show us on a microscope how many germs we had on our hands. I can remember him telling us, you know, you should always wash your hands. Look at all these germs, and he'd show us stuff on the microscope and stuff like that. But those folks actually were killed in an automobile accident. The husband and wife, Tommy Cathcart, actually lives in South America. And another friend, John Spellman, I don't know if you know John Spellman, the dentist, used to be in Westchester. He had a exchange student, and he went down to visit this exchange student. He was in one of these towns in South America, and because of the heat down there, in the evenings they sit on the rooftops. He was sitting on a rooftop and looked down the street, and here's a sign that says Cathcart's Appliances. And so the next day he went down, and it was Tommy. And he has, I don't know the story of how he ended up down there or whatever, but Tommy has an appliance store down in South America that grew up in that house there. So, yeah, there was...
Jack, you mentioned
yeah.
Campbell Weir and
Yes.
the association with him, and there's another fairly famous individual, Ian McCard,
Right.
who actually lived outside of town,
Right.
but I think he came up and frequented the Marshallton Inn
Right.
with Campbell Weir.
Right.
Do you remember any
Yeah.
of
Well-
interaction with Ian McCard at all?
Yeah, well, yeah, I had a lot of interaction. Let me tell you a little bit about Campbell Weir. He was a West Point graduate, and I think he went as far as lieutenant colonel in the Army. Came from a not famous, but a wealthy family that lived in New York. And one of the things he did when you worked for him, he would never look at what you did. Like if you had to mow the pasture, he would never go out and look at the pasture. He would go in the barn, check the mower and the tractor, and back then we used a sickle bar mower. And the tractor had to be greased, cleaned, fueled up. The sickle bar had to be taken off the tractor, put on the blocks, and all the, you tighten the tines on it, and everything had to be ready for the next time you used it. If the equipment wasn't put back in its place and taken care of, then you didn't get paid. And back then it was like 10 cents an hour or something like that. But it was kind of an interesting thing when you clean the stables and stuff. He looked at how you put the equipment away and what you did. And he and I became great friends, and I started doing woodworking in his barn, and and loving the furniture that he had in the house and some of the things. And I remember, the two of us always listened to the Army-Navy game on the radio. Of course, he was from West Point, and Roger Staubach and all those guys were playing, so we'd always do that. Ian McCard is much later. I was married. I was working for the Township when Ian McCard. He lived there at what we call the Cherry House there on Broad Run Road.
Jack, we were talking about Ian McCard, the famous land planner and
Right.
environmentalist that was ahead of his time. And
Yeah. Well, Ian moved out while I was working for the Township on Broad Run Road. And Broad Run Road went right beside his house. And he called me up one day and said, I'm going to move the road across Broad Run Creek, and I'm going to build a bridge on Broad Run Creek to move the road and so forth. And I said, no, you're not. He said, well, I had my students plan this, and I have always admired the Broad Run Creek. It's a beautiful stream, and the entire watershed is in West Bradford Township. It's an exceptional value stream. It's part of our community, and it's always been precious to me because it starts and ends in our community. It goes into the West Branch of the Brandywine. And here's this guy that's supposed to be the top environmental planner saying he's going to change everything in this stream, and I don't think you should touch anything. And so he and I got into a shouting match on the phone, and it didn't end very well. From that point on, anytime he would call and want something, his wife Betsy would get on the phone, and he would say what he wanted to know, and then she would relay it to me, and I would talk to him. He wouldn't talk to me from that point on. Now, this guy's quite a character. And I was telling somebody earlier today about him. His name came up in another instance, and he was a guy that was in a commando unit of some sort in the British Army, and when he wanted to go to Harvard, he actually wrote them a letter as a major from the British Army and said, I'm coming to do these studies at your school, and went to Harvard and said, here I am, and went to Harvard and admitted himself by his own letter. And that's kind of the character he was. But there was no way that I was going to let him mess up the Broad Run Creek. So,
Good for you.
yeah. I think that, a lot of our issues and a lot of pressures that are on our town today in our area are traffic. And I think we ought to understand what back then, what 162 was like. Actually, it was a lot narrower. The lanes were narrow. They've widened over time. Used to park on both sides of the street. And going into Westchester, after you go across Cope's Bridge and you go into Taylor Run, and we used to call it the White Horse Bridge, that was a single lane bridge up until just a few years ago. I don't know how long ago now. It had this, just pipe bars on both sides, and when there was a car coming the other way, you had to stop. And that was the Strasburg Road, Route 162. Most people wouldn't believe it today, but that was, and of course the pipe bars that on both sides were always changed after every weekend because people would hit them. There was always vehicles running over them. But I can remember you always went in there and you had to stop or slow down for a vehicle coming the other way. And the other thing that happened during snowstorms, and we used to get a lot heavier snowstorms, and it wasn't just the snowstorm of 58, but other snowstorms that we have, that there would be places along 162, they would only clear one lane. So if you're going to Westchester, typically after a snowstorm, you would have areas where it was two lanes. You'd wait there for somebody to come through, and then you'd go through, and then somebody else. And it seemed like all winter, you had areas that were always just one lane on 162. Mm-hmm. And I can remember on Telegraph Road, or not Telegraph Road, on Lucky Hill Road, that those cuts in that road would fill in. Anytime we had a snow that blew, those cuts would fill in with snow. And you'd get down Lucky Hill Road, and you'd cut off into the fields, go on the field, then get back on the road, come to the next cut was filled with snow. You'd go up on the, up in the field and then back on the road. And that was typical back then. I mean, the roads weren't cleared like they are today. We spent Sugars Bridge Road. That was the best sledding hill there ever was. We'd start up here by the school and go down Sugars Bridge Hill. You go down, turn right, and go all the way down Telegraph Road, and we did that all the time because they didn't put salt on the road, they didn't plow it, and there wasn't any traffic or anything. But all the kids we'd sled down those hills, and you wouldn't think of even trying that today. Yeah. But so the transportation is even on Sugars Bridge Road, there where Telegraph is. As you go around the corner and turn left, that was a one-lane bridge until, I'm trying to think, until 83, around when they had the Strasburg landfill, and that's when they changed that and made it two lanes. And I can remember we had our first rescue truck was an old Volkswagen ambulance that Longwood Gardens owned, and then they gave it to Good Fellowship, and Good Fellowship gave it to West Bradford, and we put, back then it was before the Jaws of Life and all that, we had all of our rescue equipment in that. We called it an ambulwag because part of the emblem was missing on the side, just an ambulwag. But a guy by the name of Charlie Entris, which was a farmer that farmed for Chick Laird down here, he was one of our guys, and when he would drive that ambulwag, and there was only a seat for one other person, so it'd be two of us in this thing going to a rescue call out on 322. And you get down there, and he would rev that thing up and slide it sideways and shoot it through that one-lane bridge and then slide it sideways and back up over the hill. Scary to death, but, that's the way things were back then. But, the roads were never like they are today. And, of course, the traffic and I don't know what we can ever do about it, but it's a problem. But it's certainly different than it was back then. The amount of traffic, and so we walked to school. Yeah, we walked to school. When I was in school here, we had a collie named was Sable, and if my mother let the collie out during the day, she'd come up to school. She'd come up from our house down the road, come up to the school, come into the door, sit by the desk, lay in this classroom. There was always a dog laying in the classroom. It was, like I said, it was Norman Rockwell stuff. It was what it was back then. Well, let me go back and come forward. And again, an association with Campbell Weir. When I was working there in the farm with him as a young boy, we put up a new board fence, and fence guys come there, carpenters, I don't know who did it, but anyway, somebody come in with a new board fence, and my job was take the wagon and the tractor and take all these old boards and put them out in the dump. Like every farm around here had a dump. And so I separated the boards and kept all the good ones. And when it took them in the barn, and we had a pond down there, so I made a boat out of these boards in the barn, so we could have it down on the pond. And Campbell Weir liked it so much, he went into Hoffman Lumber Company and bought me a bunch of mahogany, and I made a mahogany boat. So we ended up making about 3 or 4 boats. We used to take them out. He had a Jeep station wagon. He'd take Billy Fowler or my cousin Bobby, and we'd go out to King Ranch, out to the Buck and Doe Run, out by where the Buck and the Doe Run come together. And we'd put the boats in there, and we'd paddle for a day, all day long, until we got to Mortonville or Northbrook or someplace. And then he'd pick us up, and we'd bring the boats back and put them back in there. And then we ended up keeping one of the boats out there at his cabin where he painted, that I mentioned before. So I started getting in woodwork. My mother said as a kid, I always said I was going to be a gentleman farmer and make my own furniture. So again, working around, doing things at Campbell Weir's property in the historic Humphrey Marshall house, I had some instinct in it. I started liking doing that kind of stuff. So I was actually going to teach. My goal at that point was to teach industrial arts, wood shop in schools and so forth. I went to Millersville University, which is Millersville College back then, to teach industrial arts. Was there for a bit, and I got a job with Marshall Britton, who had a cabinet shop. Kind of an interesting thing. I've had 2 jobs in my life, have not applied for either one of them. When I went to Marshall Britton, I asked him, I said, I'd really like to learn a little bit more about cabinet making in the summer. And he said, I'm old, getting older, I'm about ready to retire. I'm not going to hire any more people. We talked for a while. It was a Saturday morning. I walked outside. His grass looked like it needed mowing. I said, who mows your grass? And he said, the boy up the street. And I said, well, it doesn't look like he came this week. He said, no, he doesn't always show up. I said, well, I'll mow it for you. So I mowed his grass and put the lawnmower away. And so next Saturday morning, I went in there and got the lawnmower out and mowed the lawn, put it away, went down in the shop. And although the shop was always pretty clean, I started dusting and cleaning stuff up. And he came down and he said, oh, help me move some lumber. And I said, yeah, I moved some lumber with him on Saturday. And I said, I'll see you Monday morning. He said, okay. So I went in Monday morning. I ended up working there for 14 years, ended up running the business. And then there were some issues there with me taking over the business because he wanted his son to be a part of the business. His son was not a cabinet maker. I didn't want to do that. Well, about that time, I had been active in the fire company and as a young kid. And when I first joined the fire company, it was like, grab a hose and squirt it someplace. And I thought we should be doing more than that. I found out there was Texas A&M had a set of red books. And what it was a whole series of issues on firefighting skills. So I talked the fire company into buying this set of red books, and I started taking each one, going through it, and then having a training session on it and so forth. So Bill Hill was fire chief then, and he asked me to be a lieutenant in the fire company. And, some of the older guys didn't like that because I was just a young kid, but it worked out. And it wasn't a few years I became a fire chief, and I was always an officer up there and so forth, and busy with the fire company. So as fire chief, I used to go to all the township meetings to give a fire report. And the township, about the same time that I was talking about taking over the business and owning the business at the cabinet shop, and I thought it was going to be just me, and we were working out a deal, and then all of a sudden, family came into it. I was doing this at the township. The township had had advertised as, and this is when all the development pressures first started in the township. This was in the 60s, and they were getting a lot of development pressures. The Bradford Glen, Victoria Crossing, Summit Ridge, Brandywine Green. There was a big development never happened out near DuPont property. So I was attending these meetings. They advertised for an administrative assistant. I said, I think I would like to do that, but I said, nah, I'm not going to put that in. And then things went south with talking with the deal with the cabinet manager. I was at the township meeting. They had one township manager, or administrative assistant that they hired, and he came in and didn't work out. He was doing some things that he shouldn't have been doing, and they got rid of him, and they hired another guy, and he just wasn't doing things right. And so I was at a township meeting, giving my fire report and talking with the supervisors. I watched how things were going on. On the way out of the meeting, I said to one of the supervisors, I said, look, you're going to fire that guy, and when you fire him, give me a call, because I will represent you. You can't have somebody like that represent you. I'll represent you, and I'll do it. And when I got home, I got a call from one of the supervisors. They had met the night before and decided to fire this guy. They wanted to know first how they called each other and said, how'd you know, Jay? How do you know this? And they figured out, they then called me and said, give us a letter saying you want that job. And so I typed up a letter the next day, and they hired me and as an administrative assistant. And because they didn't know what these guys were doing, they had all these things they wanted you to do and everything. But after 3 days, I called up the chairman and I said, look, you want me to do a job, I can either do all this stuff you want me to do to see that I'm doing something, or I can do the job and I'll do it my way. He said, you go ahead and do it your way. So I did. And about a month or so later, they said, we want to meet with you. And I thought, oh, here goes another administrative assistant. They said, we like the way you change things, the way you organize things. And we called the solicitor. He's bringing out a manager's ordinance. In order to have a manager in a second-class township in Pennsylvania, you have to have a manager's ordinance giving him authority. So they adopted a manager's ordinance and hired me as a manager, and I worked there for 34 years and then retired and thought I was done with it. And a few years later, a couple people came to me and said, we don't like what they're doing, the way things are going. We want you to run for office. And so I did, and now I'm a supervisor. So I've been with the township, and we've been very fortunate. We've had a lot of good people. There's a great staff up there. And, we've been able to accomplish a lot of things. Mark, you were on the planning commission. You know some of the things, innovative practices that we did, and we were able to work together. And, we did things that were remarkable even across the state. And when Governor Ridge signed some of the most important changes to the municipality's planning code back in, was it 80s, 90s? I forget the exact date. 80s. His staff called up and said, West Bradford, you folks are doing some of these things that we think should happen. Can we sign that legislation in your community?
Yeah, he flew in on that.
So he came in and we signed it where you and I worked on that transfer of development rights to save the farm, which was part of Marshall, save the Albertson farm from
It was the first one in the state.
Yeah. So we did that, and he signed that legislation in that field because of what we did. And again, that goes back to preserving the village. So it's been a fun thing. Like East Bradford did have some development pressures right close to the borough of Westchester, where they built Bradford Square and some of those things. But what happened was that our land was a lot cheaper than anything closer, And back in some of the first zoning ordinances, they allowed you to go from 1 acre zoning to half acre zoning if you had public water. And so now, if you look at Marshallton Farms, that did not have public water, and that was before zoning. Marshallton Manor at the other end of Marshallton, that was right after they started zoning, so it was right about that time. And they allowed that you could have half-acre lots if you had public water or public sewer. Well, it's cheaper to put in public water back then. And so Marshallton Manor, they put in public water, put in half-acre lots. That created a lot of zone or developments in the township. There was Bradford or Federal Drive. I forget the name of it, but Federal Drive up in there. There was a number of those developments that came in because of that, because they get more houses on an acre than they could, and so they changed that, and for a lot of good reasons. But then they did a PRD ordinance, which was a floating PRD ordinance, which was a mistake, and anybody with 75 acres or more could come in and develop a property, and with townhouses, apartments, single-family homes, commercial area, whatever they wanted. And Bradford Glen, and at that time there was 4 applications came in: Bradford Glen, Victoria Crossing, that's all the same, and then Summit Ridge. Summit Ridge was across the street, Brandywine Green, and Beyondy Tract, which was up along Romansville Road. That never got built. But what happened was Bradford Glen was 1,200 units. And at that time, they were building a lot of units on the other side of Westchester, along Westchester Pike. All those apartments they started building. And then all of a sudden, the economy changed, and they couldn't put these apartments. There was a lot of surplus units. So the developers came back and said, we want to go back to single-family dwellings. And the township was willing to do that because 1,200 homes where Brandywine Green is, and 1,200 homes, would have ruined everything. And that's when they hired some help in the township, because they were mistaken about what they were doing, and nobody was there kind of vetting these things for them. And so that's when I came in, when they were just getting ready to build Brandywine or Bradford Glen, and they were building Summit Ridge, and it's just starting Summit Brandywine Green. And we worked to minimize whatever they were doing and try to make it better, but they were already locked in to a certain number of homes, but still, again, a lot less than what was planned before. I just want people to be able to enjoy West Bradford the way we've enjoyed it, our kids, our family. It's certainly a great place to live. It's been good to us. Where we're situated, where our house is, we sit there every day and have coffee and say how great it is to live here, and I wish everybody could have this kind of a life and this kind of a place to live. And I know that we can't stop everything, but we can preserve a lot, and we can have a municipality where people can enjoy. People always said to me they don't realize the population of West Bradford is as great as it is, and I always tell them that we have rules here in West Bradford. We only let a third of the people out each day, so you don't see that many people. But our topography and what's so beautiful about West Bradford, we've been able to hide a lot of developments. You don't realize it, and if we can continue to do those kinds of things and make sure that people can live here in a good way, but preserve what they like about the township, that's what tickles me to death. And I was fortunate again. I started working with the Brandywine Conservancy as a township manager, trying to learn some things about land planning and so forth. And I attended so many meetings down there. They put me on their conservancy committee, and then ended up being chairman of the conservancy committee. And I've learned an awful lot from some great people in that regard, and how they do these things and how they preserve land. And I think when we had the opportunity, and I got on as a board member, and I could get the referendum passed with a lot of help from folks that that we get some funds for open space. We get the open space committee. I think it's so important to continue to look at what we can preserve and preserve it, because we're never going to get it back. And you know, there's so much history around here, so much beauty. It's just wonderful. I wouldn't want to be anyplace else.
Well,
Yeah.
we don't want you to be in another place.
Yep.
And thank you for your leadership
No.
in the township.
You're welcome. Thank you.